The massive warhorse stopped inches from my kneeling form. Its heavy hooves tore through the freezing mud. I stared at the midnight armor of the rider, my eyes catching the silver, snarling wolf, the crest of the Alpha King. He removed his iron helm in one fluid motion. Dark hair fell across a silver scar I knew too well. He was the silent, penniless stranger from the rainstorm. My breath caught as his gloved hand rested on his belt. Strapped against his royal plate was the plain iron blade I had hammered and sharpened for free at my dying hearth. His dark eyes pinned me in place, while his deadly army waited for a single order. But none of this terror existed 3 days ago. Heavy rain lashed against the wooden shutters of the forge. Cold water leaked through the cracks in the stone ceiling. Maine set her iron hammer on the heavy anvil. Her muscles ached from a long day of shaping horseshoes. She rubbed her sore shoulders with a soot-stained rag. The dying embers in the hearth cast dim shadows across the room. Winter was approaching fast. She needed to save every piece of coal. She reached out to close the leather bellows. The thick oak door groaned open. A sudden gust of wind scattered gray ash across the floor. A man stepped over the wooden threshold. He pushed the door shut behind him. Rain dripped from his dark hood. He stood perfectly still in the entrance. Mud coated his heavy leather boots. His dark cloak clung to his broad shoulders. Maine tightened her grip on the dirty rag. "The forge is closed," she said. Her voice echoed in the small moan. The man did not move. He raised his left hand. He carried a cloth bundle against his chest. Water pooled around his boots on the stone floor. "I seek a fire," he said. His voice sounded rough. It carried a low resonance that vibrated in her chest. Maine hesitated. Strangers rarely visited this poor village. She took a cautious step forward. "I have no food to offer," she warned him. The man slowly pushed his hood back. Dark hair clung to his forehead. His face was hard and angles carved by exhaustion. A silver scar cut across his left jaw. His eyes caught the dim light of the dying fire. They held a quiet intensity. "I do not need food," he replied. He walked toward the center of the room. His footsteps made no sound. He placed the wet bundle on her wooden workbench. He pulled back the soaked fabric. A shattered sword lay on the table. The steel was jagged. It looked as though it had struck solid iron. The hilt was wrapped in worn leather. Maine stepped closer to inspect the weapon. She picked up the broken pieces. The metal felt heavier than common iron. "This is fine steel," she murmured. She traced the uneven edge with her thumb. "It will require high heat to reforge," she added. She looked up at him. "Such work costs 2 silver coins." The man looked down at his empty hands. He lowered his chin slightly. "I have no coin," he admitted. Silence stretched between them. The rain continued to pound the roof. Maine should have ordered him out. She could barely afford her own winter rations. She looked at the broken weapon again. She then looked at his tired eyes. She knew the heavy burden of having nothing. She placed the broken steel back on the table. She let out a soft sigh. "Sit," she ordered. She pointed to a wooden stool near the wall. The man looked at her in surprise. He did not argue. He walked over and sat down. Maine turned her back to him. She grabbed an iron shovel. She tossed fresh coal into the hearth. She grabbed the leather bellows. She pumped air into the dark embers. Orange flames leaped upward. Warmth quickly filled the cold room. She picked up the broken sword with thick tongs. She thrust the steel deep into the fire. The man watched her in silence. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back. It made the hairs on her arms stand up. She ignored the strange sensation. She focused entirely on the rising heat. The steel slowly turned a bright, glowing cherry red. She pulled the metal from the flames. She placed it flat on the anvil. She raised her heavy hammer. She struck the glowing steel with a loud lang. Sparks flew into the air like tiny stars. She hit the metal again. A rhythmic cadence formed in the small space. Strike, fold, strike again. Her breath matched the steady swing of her arm. Sweat formed on her forehead. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. The man never spoke. He sat perfectly still in the shadows. He simply absorbed the heat and the sound. Hours slipped away into the dark night. The storm raged outside the stone walls. Inside there was only the fire and the hammer. Maine finally cooled the mended blade in a wooden trough. Water hissed loudly. White steam filled the air. She lifted the sword to inspect her work. The blade was whole once more. She grabbed a smooth whetstone from her bench. She slid the stone along the edge with practiced strokes. The metal began to sing a sharp note. She tested the edge with her thumb. It was sharp enough to cut a falling leaf. She wiped the finished blade with a clean cloth. She turned to face the man. "It is done," she announced. She held the sword out by its leather hilt. The man stood up from the stool. He stepped out of the shadows. He reached for the weapon. His rough fingers brushed against her knuckles. A sudden heat sparked at the point of contact. Maine quickly pulled her hand back. She wrapped her arms around herself. The man gripped the hilt tightly. He tested the weight of the sword in the air. His movements were precise. "You have a master's hands," he said quietly. "Just keep it oiled," she replied. She looked away from his piercing eyes. He lowered the blade. He wrapped it back into the dry cloth. He walked toward the heavy oak door. He paused with his hand on the iron latch. The wind howled outside. He looked over his shoulder. "I will repay this debt," he said. His voice held absolute certainty. He pushed the door open. He vanished into the harsh storm. Maine stood alone in the quiet forge. The fire popped softly in the hearth. She looked down at her hands. The warmth of his brief touch still lingered on her skin. 3 quiet days passed since the fierce storm. Frost began to cling to the wooden windows of the forge. Maine struck another hot iron on her heavy anvil. The steady rhythm usually brought her comfort. Today, her mind kept wandering away from her work. She kept glancing at the empty stool in the corner. She remembered the rough sound of the stranger's voice. She remembered the brief heat of his calloused fingers. She shook her head to clear her chaotic thoughts. She had no time for foolish daydreams. Survival required her constant focus. Winter was cruel to the poor citizens of the borderlands. She needed to finish repairing the plowshares before noon. A sudden sound shattered the morning silence. The heavy bell in the town square began to ring. The harsh clanging echoed off the stone walls. Maine dropped her iron hammer. It hit the dirt floor with a dull thud. The warning bell only rang for dire emergencies. She wiped her hands on her soot-stained apron. She rushed toward the thick door. She pushed it open and stepped into the freezing street. Chaos had already gripped the small village. Merchants scrambled to secure their wooden carts. Mothers dragged weeping children into narrow alleys. Stray dogs barked at the sudden commotion. Fear painted every face in the crowded square. Maine grabbed the arm of a passing baker. "What is happening?" she asked urgently. The old man trembled under her strong grip. "The royal banner was spotted on the eastern ridge," he gasped. His eyes were wide with blind panic. "The Alpha King is marching here." Maine felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Everyone knew the terrifying legends of the sovereign. Rumors of his brutal war still haunted the taverns. He had crushed the northern rebellion in a single night. They said he burned 3 rebel cities to ash. Enemy soldiers dropped to their knees at his mere presence. He was a ruthless leader of unmatched power. No one in this forgotten town expected a royal visit. The baker pulled his arm free and fled down the street. Maine stood frozen near the edge of the dirt road. A low rumble began to shake the frozen earth. It sounded like distant thunder approaching fast. The vibration traveled up through her worn boots. The sound grew louder with each passing second. Dust rose above the thatched rooftops. The townspeople ceased their frantic running. A heavy silence fell over the bustling square. Every villager dropped to their knees in the cold mud. They bowed their heads in silent submission. Maine slowly sank to her knees by the water trough. She kept her eyes trained on the main road. A line of armored riders crested the high hill. They rode enormous beasts bred for war. Silver steel gleamed under the gray winter sky. The soldiers moved in perfect unison. They looked more like a deadly tide than men. Dark banners flapped violently in the cold wind. The crest of the Alpha King was embroidered in silver thread. It depicted a snarling wolf wrapping around a shattered crown. The elite guard entered the village square. The heavy hooves of their mounts tore up the frozen dirt. Steel armor clanked with a terrifying rhythm. Maine held her breath as the vanguard passed her. The soldiers held long spears pointed toward the sky. Their faces were hidden behind iron helms. The procession seemed endless and suffocating. The village mayor knelt near the center of the square. He held a silver tray offering fresh bread. He trembled violently as the royal army approached. The riders did not even look at him. They ignored the traditional offering of peace. They bypassed the large stone hall entirely. The dark column turned toward the edge of town. They marched straight down the narrow dirt alleyway. They were heading directly toward the dilapidated forge. Maine felt her heart pound against her ribs. She pressed her hands flat against the freezing mud. She kept her head down like the others. The marching soldiers suddenly stopped. A sharp command ran out through the cold air. The army split down the middle with precise discipline. They formed two solid walls of dark steel. A single rider emerged from the back of the formation. His warhorse was massive and imposing. The beast snorted white steam into the freezing air. The rider wore armor dark as midnight. Thick fur lined his broad shoulders. The royal crest was stamped proudly on his chest plate. He carried an aura of suffocating authority. The mere sight of him made the air feel thin. Villagers squeezed their eyes shut in mortal terror. Maine could not force herself to look away. The massive horse stepped slowly toward her. The hooves stopped, inches from her kneeling form. Maine stared at the leather boots of the rider. A heavy silence descended upon the humble forge. Even the harsh wind seemed to hold its breath. The rider shifted his weight in the saddle. Leather groaned under the subtle movement. "Rise," a deep voice commanded. The single word carried a low resonance. Maine felt that familiar vibration in her chest again. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized that rough voice immediately. Her hands shook as she pushed herself up from the mud. She stood slowly and unsteadily. She tilted her chin up to look at the king. He removed his dark helm with one fluid motion. He rested the iron piece against his hip. Dark hair fell across his forehead. A silver scar cut sharply across his left jaw. The hard angles of his face were identical to her memory. It was the silent stranger from the rainstorm. Silas looked down at her from his tall warhorse. He did not look tired or broken anymore. He looked like a dangerous god of war. His dark eyes locked onto hers with heavy purpose. They held the same quiet intensity from that night. He was the ruler of the vast realm. He was the terrifying monster of the northern songs. He was the man who sat on her rickety stool. Maine stood speechless in her filthy apron. The contrast between them was dizzying. She was a mere blacksmith covered in soot. He commanded an army that could level the mountains. She suddenly noticed the weapon strapped to his waist. It was the broken sword she had reforged. The plain leathered hilt stood out against his royal armor. He had not discarded her humble work for finer steel. He wore it proudly at his side. Silas held her stunned gaze without blinking. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. The expression was incredibly brief and guarded. No one else in the kneeling villagers noticed the small shift. He rested his gloved hand on the pommel of his sword. His thumb brushed against the leather she had oiled. The massive army waited in tense silence for his next command. Maine stood alone among the kneeling crowd. The freezing wind pulled at her thin tunic. Silas watched her from his high saddle. His gaze pinned her in place. A sudden hiss of steel broke the silence. A high-ranking commander spurred his mount forward. The knight wore heavy armor, his face twisted in deep outrage. He pointed a long broadsword directly at Maine. "Insolent peasant," the commander barked. "Avert your eyes from the sovereign." Maine flinched at the harsh tone. She realized her dangerous mistake. She was staring directly into the king's eyes. Such a bold act invited instant death in this brutal realm. The commander looked toward Silas. "Shall I take her head, my king?" he asked. The violent words hung in the icy air. The kneeling villagers whimpered in blind terror. Maine felt her blood run cold. She looked at the sharp steel aimed at her neck. She braced herself for the fatal strike. Silas did not blink. He did not even glance at his angry commander. He slowly raised his left hand. The simple gesture carried massive weight. The commander froze instantly. He sheathed his broadsword in a desperate panic. He bowed his head until his chin touched his chest plate. Silas lowered his hand back to the leather reins. He kept his dark eyes fixed on Maine. "You would dare spill her blood?" Silas asked. His deep voice easily carried over the howling wind. The tone was quiet but terrifying. The commander swallowed hard. "She forgets her place, Alpha," the man stammered. Silas tilted his head slightly. "I decide her place," he replied. He guided his warhorse a step closer. The giant beast snorted warm breath into Maine's face. She smelled leather and cold iron. Silas leaned forward in the heavy saddle. "She has done no wrong," he stated to the silent square. "She is a master of the forge." The kneeling villagers gasped in unified shock. A lowly blacksmith had just been acknowledged by the throne. Silas addressed Maine directly. "Gather your tools," he ordered. His words were not a polite request. They were an unbreakable command. Maine finally found her voice. "My home is here," she protested weakly. The commander gasped at her bold defiance. Silas showed no visible anger. He rested his hand on his plain sword. "Your home is wherever I command it to be," he said. He looked at the dying embers inside her shop. "You have 10 minutes to pack your hammers." He turned his dark horse away. "If you delay, I will burn this village to keep you warm." Maine stared at his broad back in pure disbelief. She realized he was deadly serious. His twisted form of protection left her no choice. She turned and ran into the dark forge. Her old life was vanishing like smoke. She grabbed a worn canvas sack from the floor. She threw her heavy tongs inside. She reached for her father's favorite hammer. A dark shadow fell across the wooden threshold. 2 armored guards stepped into her small sanctuary. They held their long spears at rest. They were there to ensure she did not run. Or perhaps they were there to escort their new prize. Maine tied the canvas sack with a trembling hand. She walked out of the cold forge for the last time. A black carriage waited at the edge of the square. 4 massive horses stamped their hooves in the mud. The carriage bore the silver crest of the king. A guard opened the heavy wooden door for her. Maine climbed onto the velvet seat. She felt entirely out of place. The door snapped shut with a final click. The royal procession began to move forward. The carriage rocked over the uneven dirt road. Mayne looked through the small glass window. She watched her humble village fade into the distance. She turned her attention to the front of the column. Silas rode at the very head of the army. His dark cape billowed behind him like a storm cloud. He had promised to repay his debt. She never expected him to steal her away to do it. The journey to the royal capital would take weeks. She was now a prisoner of his gratitude. She rested her calloused hands on her canvas sack. A sudden shiver racked her small frame. It was not from the winter chill. It was from the lingering memory of his dark eyes. She knew this dangerous game had only just begun. The journey north lasted for 2 grueling weeks. Snow began to fall on the second day. The royal army moved at a relentless pace. Mayne watched the passing landscape through the glass window. She spent most hours in tense silence. The black carriage offered a clear view of the vanguard. Silas always rode at the front. He never seemed to sleep or rest. Mayne witnessed his chilling authority firsthand. A scout rode back from the mountain pass one afternoon. The young soldier brought news of a blocked road. His horse foamed at the mouth from exhaustion. The scout slid from his saddle in a panic. He knelt directly in the freezing mud. He kept his face pressed toward the ground. The man delivered his report with a shaking voice. He dared not look into his king's eyes. Silas merely nodded once in response. His silence carried more weight than 1,000 shouts. The sheer terror he inspired was suffocating. Mayne realized the true scope of his power. A single word from him could end a life. No one questioned his harsh commands. The soldiers followed him with blind devotion. They feared his wrath more than the winter storms. The rocky terrain grew harsh. Carriage wheels struck hard over deep ruts. Mayne rubbed her bruised arms. She watched the endless lines of steel. The army marched through a narrow mountain gorge. High cliffs blocked out the weak winter sun. The wind howled through the stone corridor. Silas rode ahead with unyielding posture. His giant warhorse never stumbled on the ice. Generals flanked him on both sides. They kept a respectful distance from his mount. No one dared to ride shoulder to shoulder with the king. His isolation seemed self-imposed. Mayne studied the broad line of his shoulders. She wondered about the heavy burden of the crown. He had conquered nations with ruthless efficiency. He held the power of life and death in his palm. Yet he had sought shelter in her humble shop. The memory felt like a strange fever dream. She touched her rough palms. The calluses reminded her of her low station. She was a simple toolmaker. She was dirt beneath the hooves of his horse. The royal court would never accept her presence. They would see her as a stain on his legacy. The carriage hit another sharp rock. Mayne braced herself against the velvet wall. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks. Darkness swallowed the moving army. Torches were lit along the column. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the snow. The temperature plummeted as the night deepened. Ice formed along the edges of the carriage window. Mayne pulled her flannel tunic tighter around her shoulders. It provided no defense against the bitter frost. The army finally halted to make camp. Orders echoed down the long line of men. Armored soldiers began to pitch heavy tents in the valley. Campfires bloomed like orange stars in the darkness. Mayne remained confined inside the wooden carriage. The guards offered her a small ration of dried meat. They brought no blankets or furs. A commoner did not warrant such luxuries. Mayne chewed the tough meat in the dark. Her teeth chattered in the freezing air. The cold seeped through the velvet seats. It penetrated deep into her aching bones. She curled into a tight ball on the floorboards. She hugged her canvas sack for a shred of warmth. Her breath plumed in white clouds. Sleep felt impossible in the harsh climate. She closed her eyes and prayed for morning. Footsteps crunched heavily in the fresh snow. The sound approached her isolated carriage. The low murmur of the guards abruptly stopped. A maniac clank echoed outside. The guards were dropping to their knees. The brass handle of the carriage door turned. The heavy door swung open to the night. A rush of freezing wind swept into the cabin. Maine opened her tired eyes. A tall figure filled the doorway. Silas stood against the backdrop of the dying fires. He had removed his dark helm. Snowflakes caught in his dark hair. He looked down at her shivering form. Maine tried to sit up respectfully. Her frozen limbs refused to obey. She could only stare back at his shadowed face. She expected a harsh command. She braced for another display of his cruel authority. Silas did not speak a single word. He unclasped the silver pin at his shoulder. The thick fur cloak fell from his broad back. He stepped into the cramped carriage. The small space suddenly grew warm. He knelt on one knee beside her. The great king lowered himself to the floorboards. He moved with surprising gentleness. He draped the heavy cloak over her trembling shoulders. The dark fur felt soft against her skin. It radiated a deep heat. It smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. Maine gasped softly at the sudden warmth. She looked up at his hard face. They were mere inches apart in the dark. She saw the silver scar on his jaw clearly. His dark eyes searched her face for a long moment. The terrifying warlord was gone. Only the quiet stranger from the forge remained. His large hand brushed against the fur collar. His rough knuckles grazed the side of her cold neck. A sudden jolt of electricity sparked across her skin. It chased away the winter chill instantly. Silas lingered for a fraction of a second. His gaze dropped to her trembling lips. He pulled his hand back slowly. Silas stood up in the narrow space. He stepped backward into the falling snow. The heavy door closed with a soft click. Maine sat alone in the dark carriage. She pulled the heavy cloak tightly against her chest. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The freezing night no longer felt cold. She buried her face in the warm fur. The scent of the Alpha King surrounded her senses. She knew a dangerous line had just been crossed. The true peril was not the freezing winter. It was the sudden warmth of his quiet devotion. The royal capital loomed over the rocky horizon. High stone walls pierced the gray winter clouds. Maine stared through the carriage window in silent awe. The iron gates swung open with a heavy groan. The royal army marched into the bustling outer city. Citizens cheered loudly for their returning sovereign. Maine ignored the noisy crowds outside the glass. She held her canvas sack tightly against her chest. The black carriage bypassed the public squares entirely. It climbed the steep road toward the inner keep. Guards in silver armor stood at strict attention. The carriage finally stopped in a quiet stone courtyard. A silent servant escorted Maine to a detached outbuilding. Heavy wooden double doors marked the grand entrance. Maine pushed them open with a hesitant push. Warm air washed over her cold face. She stepped into a master's sanctuary. The royal forge was massive and flawlessly organized. 4 large hearths lined the fine brick wall. Thick chains hung from the high vaulted ceiling. Racks of heavy hammers lined the smooth stone walls. Every tool gleamed with meticulous care. Maine walked toward the central anvil. It was forged from a block of dark steel. She noticed the wooden crates stacked nearby. She opened the lid of the nearest box. Ingots of rare metal caught the dim light. She saw blocks of moon silver and raw star iron. She had only heard of these materials in old tavern songs. A commoner was never allowed to touch such immense wealth. She carefully placed her worn tools on a wooden bench. Her father's hammer looked pathetic next to the royal equipment. A quiet knock sounded at the heavy door. A maid entered carrying fresh clothes and a brass basin. She brought warm water and hard lye soap. Maine washed the road dust from her tired skin. She dressed in the simple linen tunic provided. It was softer than anything she had ever worn. She tied her rough leather apron over the clean fabric. She needed to work to calm her racing mind. The familiar rhythm of the forge always grounded her. She shoveled black coal into the main hearth. She pumped the giant leather bellows. Flames roared to life with a satisfying whoosh. The memory of the king sitting in the shadows warmed her chest. She pushed the iron latch down. The heavy wooden doors swung open. A freezing draft hit her face immediately. The royal forge lay in silent ruin. Cold water flooded the main stone hearth. The giant bellows were slashed into useless ribbons. Leather strips hung sadly from the wooden frame. Precious metals were scattered across the wet floor. Someone had smashed the clay molds into fine dust. Her father's iron hammer lay in a dark puddle. The wooden handle was snapped in half. Maine stood frozen in the drafty doorway. Cruel laughter echoed from the upper balcony. A group of pure-blood nobles watched her from afar. They wore rich velvet garments in bright colors. They sneered openly at her ragged appearance. They despised the human peasant within their sacred walls. They wanted to remind her of her dirty blood. Maine swallowed the bitter lump in her throat. She did not yell or demand royal justice. A lowly blacksmith had no voice in this grand court. She walked slowly into the damp room. Her worn boots splashed in the cold puddles. She knelt on the wet stone floor. She reached into the dark sludge. She began to gather the scattered pieces of coal. Her bare hands dug through the sharp debris. A jagged piece of steel sliced her left palm. Bright blood welled up from the shallow cut. She ignored the sharp sting. She wiped the crimson drop on her leather apron. She just wanted to rebuild her quiet sanctuary. Heavy footsteps suddenly marched across the courtyard. The laughing nobles fell instantly silent. Armor clanked with frantic urgency outside. Maine looked up from the ruined floor. Silas stood in the open doorway. He wore his formal council robes. Silver chains draped across his broad chest. His dark hair was slicked back for the morning court. His dark eyes swept over the wet ashes. He saw the slashed bellows and the broken tools. His gaze finally landed on her kneeling form. The air in the forge grew dangerously cold. The king did not shout in sudden rage. He radiated a quiet, suffocating fury. He turned his dark head toward the terrified nobles. "Bring him," Silas ordered the unseen guards. 2 armored knights dragged a struggling man forward. It was Lord Vance of the High Court. The nobleman wore a blue silk doublet. He tried to stand tall before his sovereign. He sneered at the dirty forge. "She taints our sacred steel, Alpha," Vance spat. "A human rat belongs in the gutter." Maine lowered her head in deep shame. She knew the cruel words were true in their eyes. She waited for the king to agree with his lord. Silas stared at the proud noble. His face resembled a carved stone mask. He did not draw his royal sword. He simply adjusted his silver cuffs. "You dare touch what belongs to me," Silas whispered. The low voice sent a shiver down Maine's spine. Lord Vance lost his arrogant smile. The noble finally realized his fatal error. He fell to his knees in the cold mud. "Mercy, my king," Vance begged loudly. Silas looked down at the trembling lord. "Exile," he stated without a single blink. "Throw him into the northern wastes." The heavy sentence shocked the entire courtyard. The northern wastes meant a slow, freezing death. The guards dragged the screaming noble away. The harsh cries faded down the long stone corridor. A terrifying silence returned to the royal grounds. The remaining nobles scattered like frightened mice. Silas stepped into the ruined forge. His leather boots crutched over the broken clay. He ignored the expensive damage around him. He walked directly toward the wet hearth. Maine stayed on her knees. She kept her eyes fixed on the gray floor. She felt unworthy of his violent protection. The black boots stopped right before her. Silas knelt slowly on the wet stone. He ruined his expensive robes without a second thought. He reached out with his right hand. He gently took her left wrist. His grip was firm but surprisingly tender. He inspected the bleeding cut on her dirty palm. His dark eyes darkened further at the sight of her blood. "They will pay for every drop," he murmured. The fierce promise made her breath catch. Maine shook her head slightly. "It is just a scratch," she whispered. She tried to pull her hand away. Silas held her wrist in place. He reached into his dark robes. He pulled out a clean linen cloth. He wrapped the white fabric around her injured hand. He tied a careful knot over the cut. His rough fingers brushed against her sensitive skin. Maine felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She finally raised her head to look at him. Her face was streaked with dark soot. Tears threatened to spill from her tired eyes. Silas released her bandaged hand. He raised his right hand toward her face. Maine held her breath in sudden anticipation. His calloused thumb brushed against her cheek. He wiped the dirty soot from her pale skin. The intimate gesture shocked her entire system. His touch was lighter than a falling feather, and contrasted fiercely with his ruthless nature. His dark eyes held her captive in the ruins. The rest of the broken world faded away. There was only the heat of his thumb on her skin. He traced the line of her jaw slowly. His gaze dropped to her trembling lips. The silent space between them felt highly combustible. Maine knew he could conquer her with a single word. She leaned slightly into his warm touch. The small surrender echoed like thunder in the quiet room. Silas let out a jagged breath. His thumb stopped moving against her skin. He seemed to fight a massive internal battle. A loud horn sounded from the high tower outside. The harsh noise broke their fragile spell. Silas slowly lowered his hand. His expression hardened back into the untouchable sovereign. He stood up from the wet floor. "Do not leave this room," he commanded softly. "I will send my personal guard to watch the doors." He turned and walked out into the cold courtyard. Maine touched her clean cheek with trembling fingers. The skin still burned from his rough touch. She knew the angry court would never forgive this dangerous favoritism. The true war for her life had just been declared. 3 quiet days passed inside the rebuilt forge. Silver-clad knights stood watch outside the wooden doors day and night. Maine worked the hot iron with intense purpose. She wanted to craft the perfect armor for him. She hammered the rare star iron until her muscles burned with exhaustion. The dark metal folded beautifully under her steady strikes. She shaped a pair of magnificent steel bracers. They were designed to protect his vulnerable inner arms during combat. She lined the cold metal with soft black leather. She wanted to ensure the heavy guards would not chafe his skin. The winter sun finally dipped below the high castle walls. Long shadows stretched across the smooth stone floor. The iron latch of the door clicked softly. Silas stepped quietly into the warm room. He closed the heavy door behind him to block the freezing wind. He wore a simple dark tunic tonight. No royal chains adorned his broad chest. He looked incredibly tired from endless council meetings. Maine wiped her dirty hands on a damp linen rag. She bowed her head slightly in formal greeting. Silas walked slowly toward the central wooden bench. He noticed the finished bracers shining in the dim firelight. "You work too late into the night," he noted quietly. "The steel must cool naturally," she replied. She picked up the polished arm guards from the table. "I need to test the fit on your forearms." Silas nodded in silent agreement. He reached for the leather laces of his dark tunic. He pulled the thick garment over his head. He tossed the shirt onto a nearby wooden stool. Maine froze instantly with the steel in her hands. The warm firelight danced across his bare skin. His muscular torso was a brutal map of past violence. Terrible white scars crisscrossed over his stomach. Deep, jagged lines wrapped around his broad shoulders. A massive burn mark covered his left ribs. These were not the clean wounds of a glorious noble duel. They were the desperate marks of brutal survival. They spoke of torture and endless betrayal in the dark. They were the true cost of his terrifying reputation. Most palace servants averted their eyes in pure panic. No noble lord dared to look at the broken king. They only wanted to see the pristine golden crown. Maine did not look away from his ruined skin. She stepped closer to his towering frame. Her old boots had a soft sound on the stone floor. She lifted the right bracer with careful hands. She pressed the cold steel against his warm forearm. Silas watched her face with intense scrutiny. He waited for the inevitable disgust to appear in her eyes. He expected her to tremble at his monstrous form. Maine secured the first leather buckle over his wrist. Her thumb brushed against a raised scar near his elbow. The twisted flesh felt rough under her calloused finger. She did not pull her hand back in horror. She slowly traced the gigantic upfold toward his shoulder. "Who did this to you?" she asked softly. Her quiet voice broke the heavy silence of the room. Silas looked down at her gentle hands. His strong jaw tightened for a brief second. "My father," Silas answered. The stark truth hung heavily in the warm air. He demanded a living weapon, not a soft son. Maine felt a sharp ache in her chest. The terrifying warlord was just a surviving boy underneath the armor. He had been forged in extreme pain, much like her iron. "He threw me into the fighting pits," Silas continued. His deep voice held a detached, hollow tone. "I fought feral beasts until I forgot my own name." Maine secured the second buckle with steady, rhythmic hands. She moved silently to his left arm. She placed the second bracer against his bare skin. She noticed a jagged mark directly over his heart. It looked like the fatal strike of a jagged spear. She paused her work entirely. She raised her left hand toward his chest. The white bandage on her palm was gone now. Only a faint red line remained from the broken clay. She pressed her fingertips gently against the old chest wound. Silas sucked in a sharp, sudden breath. His chest rose and fell rapidly beneath his touch. The brutal monster of the north vanished in an instant. He was laid bare before a simple human blacksmith. "It must have hurt terribly," Maine whispered. She kept her hand flat against his beating heart. The steady rhythm thudded hard against her rough palm. Silas closed his dark eyes. He leaned slightly into her warm touch. "The blade did not hurt," he murmured. He opened his eyes to meet her upward gaze. "The betrayal from my own blood is what nearly killed me." Maine felt the raw vulnerability in his deep words. He was handing her the keys to his hidden soul. No steel armor could protect him in this quiet moment. He raised his own right hand slowly. He placed his large palm over her small hand. He pressed her fingers closer to his bare chest. The heat between them rivaled the blazing hearth nearby. "You are the only one who truly looks at me," he confessed. "The noble council only sees a rabid hound." Maine shook her head slowly. "I see a man," she replied firmly. "I see a man who survived the fire." The simple words echoed loudly in the silent room. Silas let out a long, ragged exhale. His dark eyes shone with an unspoken reverence. He lowered his head slowly toward hers. His dark hair brushed softly against her forehead. They stood locked together in the dim, golden light. The scent of wood smoke and leather surrounded her senses. She closed her eyes and leaned forward. Their foreheads rested gently against each other. The physical contact sent sparks rushing through her veins. It was a desperate, quiet surrender of their boundaries. He was claiming her without a single kiss. She was accepting him despite a massive danger. They stayed in that quiet embrace for a long minute. The roaring fires seemed to fade into the background. A sudden loud knock slammed against the heavy doors. The harsh sound shattered their fragile peace immediately. Silas snapped his head up instantly. The dangerous king returned to his hardened face. He stepped back and reached for his dark tunic. "Enter," Silas barked loudly toward the entrance. A royal guard pushed the wooden door open. The soldier bowed deeply toward the stone floor. "Forgive the intrusion, Alpha," the guard said quickly. "The Wolf Council has convened an emergency tribunal in the Great Hall." Silas narrowed his dark eyes at the nervous messenger. "On what grounds?" he demanded coldly. The guard hesitated for a terrible second. He cast a quick, nervous glance toward Maine. "They claim the human has bewitched the crown." The icy words dropped the room temperature to freezing. Maine felt the warm blood drain from her face. The unseen war had finally reached the royal forge. Heavy footsteps echoed down the long stone corridor. A dozen armed guards escorted them toward the royal courtroom. Maine walked 2 paces behind the silent king. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air grew significantly colder near the central keep. Giant wooden doors loomed at the end of the hall. 2 armored sentries pushed the heavy oak open. The great hall was packed tightly with angry nobles. Torches burned fiercely against the high stone walls. A massive circular cable dominated the center of the room. 12 elders sat in high-backed wooden chairs. They wore dark ceremonial robes of the High Council. Their faces held harsh, unyielding judgment. Silas walked straight toward the elevated throne. He did not sit on the velvet cushion. He stood tall before the silent council. Maine stayed near the entrance under heavy guard. Hundreds of hostile eyes lacked onto her small frame. She kept her chin raised despite her deep fear. She refused to cower before these cruel lords. The oldest council member stood up slowly. His name was Elder Thorn. He held a thick parchment scroll in his bony hands. The old man cleared his throat with deliberate slowness. The murmuring crowd fell into dead silence immediately. "My king," Thorn began. His rough voice lacked any real respect. "The council has reached a unified decision tonight." Silas crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Speak your treason plainly," Silas commanded. His voice was terrifyingly calm. Thorn unrolled the thick parchment on the wooden table. "The kingdom requires a stable bloodline," the elder stated. "You have neglected your duty to the royal lineage. The neighboring pacts grow restless in the west. We have drafted a binding treaty of marriage." Thorn pointed a crooked finger at the open scroll. "You will marry Princess Alara of the Moon Pack. The ceremony must happen before sunset today." A low murmur of approval rippled through the noble crowd. They wanted a pure-blood queen to secure their own power. Silas did not react to the sudden demand. He simply stared at the old man. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Silas asked softly. Thorn rolled up the heavy scroll with a sharp snap. The elder glared directly at Maine across the room. "Then we must purge the rot from the sacred castle." Maine felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "The human has clearly bewitched your mind," Thorn accused loudly. "She uses dark magic to blind our sovereign. No sane ruler would place a filthy peasant above his own court." Thorn raised his chin in arrogant defiance. "If you reject this royal union, the blacksmith will burn. We will execute her for high treason before dusk." The brutal ultimatum hung heavily in the tense air. The council possessed the legal authority to execute a commoner. Even a king could not easily overturn a unified council vote. The noble crowd watched Silas with hungry anticipation. They expected him to realize his foolish mistake. They waited for him to cast the human aside. Maine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She accepted her cruel fate in that quiet moment. Her brief time with the fire and the king was enough. She opened her eyes to look at Silas one last time. Silas stood perfectly still on the raised dais. He did not yell at the arrogant council. He did not threaten them with immediate exile. He simply unclasped his dark cape. He let the heavy fabric fall to the stone floor. His right hand moved smoothly toward his leather belt. He grabbed the plain leather hilt at his left side. The steel hissed loudly against Dorne's scabbard. He drew the weapon in a single fluid motion. It was the same broken sword Maine had fixed in the rainstorm. The polished blade caught the orange firelight beautifully. It lacked any royal jewels or gold inlay. It was a simple instrument of pure violence. Silas stepped down from the elevated throne. His leather boots made a soft thud on the floor. The crowd parted frantically to let him pass. He walked directly toward the circular table. He stopped inches away from Elder Thorne. Silas raised the steel weapon slowly. He pointed the sharp tip directly at the elder's throat. The cold metal pressed slightly against the old man's skin. Thorne stumbled backward in sudden mortal terror. His wooden chair crashed loudly to the floor. The entire hall gasped in unified shock. Royal guards instinctively reached for their swords. A single glare from Silas froze them in place. No soldier dared to draw steel against the Alpha King. Silas held the deadly blade perfectly steady. His dark eyes promised an immediate bloody massacre. He had promised to repay a debt in the rain. The council had just given him the perfect opportunity. The sharp tip of the deadly blade rested against Thorne's pale skin. A single drop of red blood welled up under the cold steel. The liquid trickled slowly down the elder's wrinkled neck. The great hall remained trapped in a suffocating silence. The crackling torches provided the only sound in the vast room. Silas did not blink his dark eyes. His breathing remained steady. He held the life of the High Elder in his calloused hand. "You speak of royal duty," Silas whispered into the quiet space. His rough voice echoed off the high walls. The sound sent a visible shiver down Thorne's rigid spine. "You speak of noble bloodlines and political treaties." Silas pressed the sharp blade a fraction closer. Thorne whimpered quietly like a wounded hound. The old man squeezed his pale eyes shut. "I forged this kingdom in pure violence," Silas reminded the terrified council. "I conquered the Northern Rebellion while you hid behind these stone walls. I bled in the dark mud to secure your velvet chairs." He tilted his dark head slightly. "My crown is not a bargaining chip for your political games." Silas lowered the steel weapon slowly. Thorne gasped loudly for sudden air. The elder collapsed back into his wooden chair. Silas turned his attention toward the massive table. The open scroll of the marriage treaty lay exposed. The wax seal gleamed under the orange firelight. Silas raised his simple weapon high above his head. He brought the heavy blade down with devastating force. The steel struck the thick wood with a deafening crack. Wood splintered violently across the stone floor. The heavy parchment ripped into jagged halves. The royal seal shattered into tiny pieces. Elder Thorne scrambled frantically away from the flying debris. The old man fell hard onto his hands and knees. Silas pulled the sharp blade free from the ruined wood. He sheathed the weapon in one fluid motion. The metal hissed loudly against the worn scabbard. He turned his broad back on the trembling council. He did not offer them a second glance. Their political power meant nothing to him anymore. He looked across the silent courtroom. His dark gaze cut through the sea of hostile faces. It locked onto Maine standing near the heavy doors. She stood still against the giant frame. Her ragged clothes contrasted sharply with the rich garments around her. She had expected to burn on a wooden pyre today. She had accepted her cruel fate just moments ago. Now she watched the savage king rewrite the future. Silas began to walk toward her. His leather boots struck the floor with a steady rhythm. The heavy sound echoed like a marching drum. The noble crowd parted in frantic waves. Lords and ladies shoved each other to escape his path. Nobody dared to stand before the advancing sovereign. They shrank back into the dim shadows of the hall. They lowered their heads in sudden terror. The oppressive atmosphere of the room shifted. The Alpha King was claiming his chosen territory. He walked with the terrifying grace of a hunting predator. Maine felt her pulse pound in her dry throat. She could not look away from his intense stare. Silas reached the edge of the scattered crowd. He stopped in front of the two royal sentries. The armored guards held their long spears with shaking hands. They blocked his direct path to the human blacksmith. "Step aside," Silas commanded in a low voice. The simple order carried the weight of a royal execution. The sentries threw themselves out of his way. They dropped their iron weapons onto the floor. They bowed dulkily toward the cold stone. They did not dare to raise their terrified eyes. Silas stepped forward and stood directly in front of Maine. The physical distance between them finally vanished. He stared down into her wide eyes. The roaring torches cast golden light across his hard face. He looked calm despite the surrounding chaos. He did not look like a savage warlord anymore. He looked like a tired man who had finally found home. Maine forgot the angry nobles gathered around them. She forgot the terrible threat of the burning fire. There was only the quiet heat of his dark eyes. There was only the scent of pine and leather. Silas slowly reached for his thick belt. He unbuckled the heavy strap with steady hands. He held the encased weapon in his right grip. It was the same sword she had mended in the cold rain. It was the weapon that had just humbled the High Council. Then the Alpha King did the impossible. He stepped backward to create a small space between them. He bent his right leg with deliberate grace. Silas dropped to one knee before the human blacksmith. A collective gasp ripped through the crowded hall. The sound was deafening in the quiet space. Noble ladies covered their mouths in deep shock. Some lords dropped their silver goblets in sheer panic. Metal cups clattered loudly against the stone floor. Red wine spilled across the ground like fresh blood. The Alpha King bowed to no mortal creature. He did not kneel for foreign emperors. He only knelt for the ancient gods. Now he knelt in the dirt before a lowly commoner. He lowered his proud head in pure submission. He offered his vulnerable neck to a human girl. Maine felt a hot tear slip down her dirty cheek. The salt water carved a clean track through the dark soot. She could not believe the surreal sight before her. Her chest ached with an overwhelming warmth. Silas raised his dark head to look at her. He held the Siva's sword up toward her chest. He rested the leather slabbard across his open palms. It was an ancient gesture of absolute surrender. "You forged this blade in the dark," Silas said. His deep voice resonated in her aching chest. It carried easily to every corner of the silent hall. "You sharpened the dull edge without asking for coin." He held her tearful gaze with unwavering intensity. "You gave me warmth when the world offered only frost." Maine reached out with trembling hands. She hesitated for a brief second. She knew touching the royal weapon would change her life. There would be no returning to her quiet village. There would be no escape from his dangerous world. She lowered her hands with sudden resolve. She placed her rough fingers over the leather hilt. The familiar texture grounded her racing mind. His large hands remained steady beneath hers. His skin radiated a deep, comforting heat. "I reject the council and their false treaties," he declared. His voice grew slightly louder for the court to hear. "My life belongs to the fire of your forge." He tightened his grip on the leather scabbard. He pressed the weapon firmly into her small hands. "Take this sword as my eternal vow." The silent rune hung desperately on his every word. "You are my only queen," Silas vowed loudly. "You are my only faith." The powerful words cemented her place in the violent history. Maine tightened her grip on the heavy weapon. She felt the solid weight of the fine steel. She looked down at the kneeling sovereign. She saw the quiet stranger from the rainy night. She saw the broken man who survived the fighting pits. She slowly pulled the sword toward her chest. She accepted the dangerous burden of his devotion. Silas let out a jagged breath of immense relief. The heavy tension left his broad shoulders instantly. He stood up gracefully from the stone floor. He ignored the shocked whispers erupting across the noble court. He reached out with his right hand. He took her injured left hand gently. His rough thumb brushed against the white bandage. He intertwined his fingers firmly with hers. He pulled her gently against his strong side. He turned to face the stunned council together. His dark eyes dared anyone to voice an objection. The grand hall remained silent. Nobody moved a single muscle. The proud lords lowered their eyes in bitter defeat. The savage king had chosen his eternal mate. He had placed a peasant above the ancient laws. Maine leaned her head against his broad shoulder. The freezing winter could no longer touch her. She was protected by the fiercest fire in the realm.
And that's how a single spark in the cold changed an entire kingdom. If Silas and Maine's story warmed your heart today, please make sure to hit that subscribe button for more. I always love seeing how far our forge's fire has reached, so drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, let me know, what did you feel when the terrifying Alpha King finally knelt? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.